Welcome to today's webinar, 5 High Liability Issues for Public Schools, a 1-hour interactive webinar which will focus on 5 key issues related to safety and security problems in elementary, middle, and high school. During today's presentation, our presenters will cover the following: lack of accurate understanding of safety issues, planning without assessment, guessing is not planning, reaction is not prediction, poor management of schools, the real issue in school safety, lack of effective plans to combat truancy and lateness. Truancy is the root of all safety issues, and poor emergency management. Don't ask amateurs to do what professionals do without training. The presenters for today's webinar are Dale Yeager and Andy Demidont. Dale is the president and CEO of SchoolsThe, a consulting and training firm. SchoolsThe offers corporations, schools, colleges, hospitals, government agencies, municipalities, law firms, and individuals a vast array of programs to solve problems. In 2002, Congress asked Dale and his expert team to produce a State of School Safety in America report. Since that time, SchoolsThe has provided 3 such reports to Congress. Dale's research work on school violence has been published in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin and the Texas Attorney General's report on school violence. In 2005, Dale was appointed to the Development Committee for the Fairleigh Dickinson University School Security and Safety Administration Master's Program. Dale and his expert team have provided school safety training for over 26,000 schools in the United States. Andy Demidont is retired from the public education system after more than 35 years of service. During Andy's tenure in public education, he held various positions such as assistant principal, high school principal, and superintendent. He also taught graduate education courses at Mansfield State University. Andy has been nominated to serve on a statewide task force for the restructuring of education in the state of Pennsylvania. He's also the recipient of numerous state and national awards. If you have any questions during the presentation, I urge you to use the chat feature, which is found on the right-hand side, or the Q&A feature, which is found below it. Dale and Andy will do their best to answer the questions that come up during the presentation during the event. Additionally, Dale and Andy have agreed to stay on the line after the presentation to answer any questions that may arise. With that said, approximately 1 hour after the event, we'll send out an email with the archived recording link. And we do ask that you take the time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after the webinar is over. I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the webinar. I'm now going to turn it over to Dale and his team, who are going to present today's content. Dale, it is all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. I know that joining us is a mixed group of people. We have attorneys. We have attorneys who represent schools, attorneys who have brought cases against schools. We have superintendents. We have various school board members. What we're going to do today is talk about these 5 high liability issues from both sides of the arena. We're not going to focus on one side or the other. I'm going to go through these 5 issues of high liability fairly quickly, and then we're going to spend most of the time answering your questions. And from past experience, we'll need about 50 to 45 minutes of time to answer those questions. And Andy Demidont will be doing most of the talking when it comes to answering those questions. So here we go. First of all, one of the things that we need to do is we need to talk about the facts. There are national facts that come from the Juvenile Justice Bulletin, OJJDP, which is part of the Justice Department, and then there are facts on an individual level where your school districts are. So let's look at the national facts. 2.7 million crimes are committed at schools every year in America. Of the 2.7 million crimes, 73% are suburban and rural schools. Most people see school safety as an urban problem, and that's a problem unto itself. One of the things we find is that suburban school districts have the biggest problem with this issue of school safety because they truly believe they don't have many problems. They see things on a surface basis. And if you're working with a suburban type school district, this is a critical element in school safety that you have to address, is this idea that because we're suburban, we don't really have as many problems. And this is a part of the process that we're going to talk about in the next slide. Students ages 12 through 18 were more likely to be victims of non-fatal violent crimes such as rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault. Total crimes committed in schools to this age group are 253,000. Of that number, 60% are rural and suburban schools. Again, please think about this issue of school safety and liability from a holistic, with a W, holistic perspective. Every area is having problems. In fact, it's interesting, one of the things I tell, and Andy talks about when we teach educators, every school system in America has gangs. And when people say, no, Dale, we have no gangs, you have juggalos and you have straight edge. You just don't know about it. And those are considered gangs by the federal government, by the Justice Department. And the thing is that if you go on Facebook or MySpace, you'll find all the juggalos and straight edge kids who are in your school system. The information is publicly available. Teachers are the victims of over 400,000 violent crimes each year in America. Now, when the Justice Department talks about violent crime against teachers, they use the term teacher to describe teachers and administrators. So this is also principals. What's interesting is that this is a growing problem. Now, there are three groups of people that commit violent crime, according to Justice Department research, against teachers and administrators. First is kids and students, but only 5 points behind them are parents and caregivers. And then third, one I want you to think about for a moment from a liability perspective, is other staff members. One of the problems is that if you're focused on the school shooter, you're not seeing the big picture. You're not seeing the big picture of school safety, because there are people that are employed in your school system locally who are dysfunctional, who are emotionally disturbed, who are violent, who have criminal tendencies. And this is where HR, human resources, has to be trained to understand these problems. Much of the problem is because due diligence or background checks aren't properly done. One of the other problems is the management of the adult staff members is poorly done in many cases by the people who have to manage them within a school system. And so I want you to think about this 400,000 in a broader perspective, not just the school shooter, but all of the people, both adults and juveniles and children, who can cause these crimes. Next, I want to talk about types of school violence. Again, think broadly, think holistically. Student to student, student to teacher, teacher to student, teacher to staff, staff to student, vendor to student, visitor to student, visitor to teacher. According to the U.S. Justice Department, it's interesting to find that vendors actually account for about 1/3 of all the crimes committed in schools. So this is the Pepsi guy, the milk lady, the person who comes and sells insurance to the teachers. Here's the vendor policy in most schools. Vendor comes in, goes to the front office, signs in, gets a pass, and then the pass somehow creates some type of a force field to prevent them from touching anybody or stealing anything. And this is just poor management right in the outset. If a vendor or any visitor is in a school, they must be monitored with human eyes. Now, some of you who are listening know that there are cameras in the local school system or in your school system, depending what side you're coming from. But none of you have security cameras with cognitive function or peripheral vision. Only human beings have that. And the problem is when you depend too much on equipment, and Andy will talk about this later, you're actually going to increase your liability. You actually increase liability with this, with the dependence on security equipment. Vendors and all visitors have to be monitored. And so it's critically important that you think about that in the process. Now, the first issue of liability is lack of accurate understanding of safety issues. First of all, we talked about national information when it comes to school safety. Let's talk about where the school system is locally, your school system or the school system that you operate or work in. One of the things you're going to have to ask yourself is, do you have an accurate understanding of what's really going on? Do you have a detailed understanding, or do you have a pretty good idea? Because, you know, as a scientist, I have a problem with a phrase like, oh, I have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. That's not good enough. If you don't assess what's going on in your school at every level from a management perspective, you're not going to know what the problems are until they rear their ugly head and cause a lawsuit or cause a problem. And this is important to understand. You've got to find a process that digs deep and looks at every layer of management, every layer from custodians all the way up to the administrators. What do you know about what's going on in that local school system? Many attorneys who bring lawsuits against school systems, we find when we work with them, do not understand the process of what goes on in a school system. School systems are complicated entities. They have many layers. And unless you're an administrator or someone who's worked in a school system, you're not going to understand them. That's why, you know, Andy is a former school superintendent, a problem solver. That's all I hire for that division of the company, because they understand how schools operate. They understand the intricacies. And if you don't understand the management issues, you don't really understand schools. Number two is reaction, not prediction. More and more school systems, especially school board members, are reacting to problems. And their first reaction is, well, let's just buy a whole bunch of security equipment to solve the problem. Again, a camera, a lock cannot stop something. It can't prevent it. It can't predict and prevent a problem. And so this prediction, this reaction, not prediction, is one of the major management flaws in school systems that create liability issues. Reacting. First of all, when it comes to human resources, let's look at that for a moment. If you've got an adult staff member who's committed a crime, for example, I don't know if most of you know this or not, but several weeks ago, before the shooting by the Professor Bishop down at Alabama, there was a shooting by a teacher in an elementary school in Tennessee. This teacher shot the principal and assistant principal in their office. The question that I have is, why was this teacher hired in the first place? But secondly, where was the management? Where was the management in understanding what was going on with that teacher? Why was no one trained to understand from a management perspective to predict and prevent that violent behavior? That's a question that needs to be answered that nobody's asking. Again, are your policies and your management system based on reaction, or are they based on prediction, good leadership? And for attorneys who have suits against school districts, you need to be asking the question, do I understand as an attorney the layers of management within a school system? Do I really understand all the breakdown? Because they all play off of each other like a domino effect. Next, poor management of schools, poor time management. You know, management of time is critical to a well-managed school. Non-data-based decisions. You have people making emotional decisions, both on an administrator level and a school board level. That's no way to run a school, and that's going to create liability issues. Unwillingness to depart from conventional thinking. Well, this is the way we've always done it. It always amazes me, by the way, that every state in the country that we work in 18 states, have a policy or have changed their statewide policy to say that you're responsible for a student door to door. That just changed actually just recently in New York State. And the thing is that if you're responsible for your students door to door, why in the world would you have an open campus policy for seniors? Because once you let the seniors or any student off campus during lunchtime, you've now violated state law. Now you've created a liability problem because you can't monitor them when they're running through town, doing whatever they're doing during lunch break. And so right there is a great example. But when we ask school administrators, well, why do you not change this policy? They say, pressure from the parents. The parents had it this way when they went here. They want the same thing. Well, many things that I did in the 80s I don't do now in the 2000s. And so this is a lack of leadership, a lack of standing up to the community and saying this is the way things are going to be done. And again, you're creating a liability nightmare because you cannot monitor those kids running around town. School boards being asked to make decisions without essential data. We talk to school board members all the time at conferences, and one of the things we hear from them is, I'm not getting all the information. Well, the question is, why aren't you demanding it? Well, We get a lot of excuses from the security director or from an administrator, but we're not getting all the critical data. Well, if you don't ask for specific data, you're not going to get specific data. But the bigger question is, do you have all the essential data that you need? Now, if you're an attorney who represents a school district or you're an attorney who has an action against the school district, that essential data, that critical data, how accurate is it? Who gathered it? How was it gathered? All of those are critical questions to ask. Poor use of technology to handle the mundane tasks. Most people don't realize that there is redundancy, unneeded redundancy within school systems, with software programs, with all sorts of technology that really is a waste of time and a waste of money and actually causes management conflicts, which again can feed into liability issues. Lack of effective, ongoing, interactive, community-wide communications. It amazes me how many school systems only have a news conference after something has happened. Now, we have a school system locally here who had a national news story about a problem they had management-wise with technology, and so they had the news conference after the fact. The bottom line in communicating effectively on a community-wide basis is having ongoing news conferences and communicating with the public, with the parents on a regular basis. This is so critically important, but it's generally not done. Again, reaction, not prediction. Reaction. Lack of effective plans to combat truancy and lateness. Truancy is the root of all school safety problems. Don't get upset. Listen carefully to what I said. Truancy is the root of all school safety problems because let me tell you what truancy means. Truancy is code for dysfunctional families. Dysfunctional families produce dysfunctional children who are the main problems in school systems in negative behavior cliques, in gangs, in sexual harassment, all sorts of things. If you don't deal with these parents or these dysfunctional families effectively, you're going to have a continued problem with truancy and lateness, and that is going to affect negative behavior cliques, gangs, sexual harassment, all sorts of other problems. Liability reduction starts truly, and we have seen this in all the schools we work in dealing with truancy and lateness. And by the way, in No Child Left Behind and its modification recently by the President, lateness is actually a part of it. In fact, under federal law, if a child is late 10 times or more, 4 times in a row, that counts as 1 day of absence against that school system when it comes to funding. Most school systems don't realize this. And so, again, you can correlate that. And by the way, the Justice Department correlates truancy with, by the way, juvenile sex offenders, gang members, and other types of behavior, negative behavior and criminal behavior by children. There's actually research studies that show truancy is a correlation. There's a correlation between truancy and criminal behavior by children and juveniles. Number 5, poor emergency management. Don't ask amateurs to do what professionals do without proper training. You know, one of the things we teach is that in an emergency, fear is biological. You're going to be afraid. I don't care how long you've done this, you're going to be afraid. Whether you're a cop, a firefighter, an EMT, you're going to be afraid. That's biological, but panic is a choice. Out of Columbine, the dirty little secret of Columbine that nobody wants to talk about is that 38% of the teachers abandoned their students and ran out of the building. They panicked. They did a narcissistic act, but they did that because no one had trained them how to deal with that. One of the things we teach in schools is this, real simple. If you can't execute your emergency plan in a given school with only 40% of your adult staff, you need to go back and redesign it. Because if you truly believe that every adult is going to be available during an emergency, you're kidding yourself. Some of them will be dead, some will be sick, some will panic and run away. Some will be on vacation. You can't assume that you're going to have 100% of them. You should assume that you're going to have 40% at best. And so, but also, really, you're asking people to do something that they are not skilled to do. Unless you've been trained or have extensive experience in dealing with emergencies, you can't manage an emergency. It's not natural. Natural says, biology says, I run away from dangerous things. This is where a lot of problems happen when an emergency occurs, and now there's lawsuits and there's liability because, again, proper training didn't occur. And a lot of times policies are poor. Let me give you an example. Very rarely do we ever find in a school emergency plan anything related to special needs children. Now, there are 7 types of autism. Most common is Asperger's syndrome. So we have an increase, a dramatic increase, according to DOJ and the Department of Ed, in children with autism. Well, guess what? The problem is that when a child who's scared, who has special needs, emotional or otherwise, gets scared, they basically curl up in a ball in a fetal position, start screaming, and I don't know if you've ever tried to move a 40-pound child. They feel like 200 pounds if they don't want to move. And no one is dealing with this issue. One of the assumptions is, well, the special ed teachers know how to talk to these kids. That's not accurate because most of them don't. When we ask them, they say, no one ever trained me how to deal with them in an emergency. So assumption is a problem unto itself. A poor emergency management increases liability 10-fold, 20-fold. Again, don't ask amateurs to do what professionals do without training. So, at this point, we're going to ask that you submit your questions, and Andy and I, primarily Andy, we're going to try to answer them to the best of our ability.
Well, thank you, guys. That's a great presentation of content. We do have a question that was submitted to us by Jody, who asked, do you see liability on the part of a school board for foreseeable injuries caused by teenagers roughhousing in a classroom with a student teacher present where the injured student did not consent to the horseplay?
Andy?
The answer is unequivocally yes. There is an exposure there for the school board, since the school board is responsible for hiring the staff. It's responsible for, in most cases, the student teacher being approved through board action. The conditions surrounding that situation would largely predicate the level of exposure that the board has, i.e., presume for a moment that the class has had a history of, how shall we characterize it, somewhat rowdy behavior, or has a group of students that have been known to have exhibited consistently poor behavior. And to leave that class with a regular teacher, the regular classroom teacher leaving that class and leaving it in charge by a student teacher, I think the district runs the risk under those circumstances of some legal exposure. In particular, one of the other conditions is, what's the level of that student teacher? Are we talking about the first day, the first week? Are we talking about halfway through the year? In other words, has there been some preparation for that student, and have they been a student teacher, and have they been able to manifest the ability to control a difficult class? So there's a level of exposure there. The conditions surrounding what transpired would probably, would surely indicate to what degree that exposure rests on the board, the administration, and the district.
Thank you. Great answer, Andy. I have 2 questions from Steve. The first, he asked, are there any federal statutes or regulations that he should look at that kind of govern what you guys have been talking about during this presentation? And where would he go to find those sorts of things? Should he go to Department of Education, Department of Justice? Is there an association he can go to?
Well, let me answer some of that, and then Andy can he can answer that also. There are state regulations, and then there are federal regulations, and the bottom line is that most of the time, both of those are guidelines. It depends on what state we're talking about, but they are guidelines. They're overviews, and some of them are actually law. But the thing is that just because the state has specific statements about bullying or the federal government, there's also added on to that the liability issues on a personal level when that bullying happens. Sometimes there's more detail that a school district needs to add to those guidelines on a state and federal level to truly be predicting and preventing bullying. So, Andy, do you want to add to that, or?
Well, what I would add to it goes really from, in most states, I'll start with Pennsylvania since that happens to be my home state. In Pennsylvania specifically, there is a Child Protective Services Act which governs what school personnel do with students in terms of protecting their health, welfare, and moral well-being. And that responsibility is very clear. Most states have something similar to that on the books. So that would be an area that I would certainly advocate people taking a look at. The Department of Justice has an entire listing of literature on what the role of administrators should be, what the role of teachers should be, what the role of the custodians should be. Everything from door monitoring to the broken window theory that applies to most organizations. By that I mean simply how to make sure that routine maintenance issues are addressed within your school, because if they're not addressed, what we know for sure is those kinds of things lead to consistently more serious types of problems for schools in terms of the overall management and the overall safety of the student body. There's a whole segment of literature out there that talks about what happened after Columbine. What happened after Columbine is that schools went out and rapidly decided that the solution, and I think Dale touched on this earlier, to their school safety and security issues rested with purchasing cameras, metal detectors, so forth and so on. What we have learned and what the literature is telling us is that, for the most part, was an inefficient use of money in many instances, because the equipment did not fit into the overall culture of the school. And so what happened was, when the equipment was purchased, the staff, and by staff I'm talking about administrator, teacher, custodian, cafeteria worker, bus driver, basically kind of breathed a sigh of relief, thinking, our job is done. The cameras and the metal detectors will take care of our overall school safety and security issues. And what we have learned since that sense of euphoria that, okay, we're taken care of, has set up a condition that has allowed staff to really kind of ignore some of their day-to-day responsibilities, i.e. wearing ID passes, simply challenging people who come into the building. Many teachers are very reluctant and, in fact, in some instances, don't even see it as part of their job, as challenging visitors that come into school. Those are the kinds of things that much of the literature and much of our efforts concentrate. What we will what we refer to as low-cost, no-cost preventative safety and security measures that can be very quickly brought about within a school system. So.
And then Andy, let me add this. Any teacher contract that states, and I've seen them, and Andy has seen them, that states that monitoring hallways or any kind of monitoring of students for security is not part of their responsibility, that's a violation of every state in the United States. And I'm going to tell you why. It's also Canadian law, because every state in the United States has a Child Welfare Act. And then every state in America also has special child welfare laws under the DOE requirements, the Department of Ed requirements in that state. So when they put that in a contract, they're violating state law sometimes once or sometimes twice. Would you agree with that, Andy?
Yeah, if it's in the contract, I don't know how you can put something in the contract that basically flies in the face of your duty to report and your duty to protect the health, welfare, and moral well-being of the students.
Well, can we move on, Matt, to this? I have another question here from Steve McCarthy.
Sure, go for it. Yep.
Okay, it says, I'm dealing with a school with a history of parents taking kids out because of bullying. What are the schools supposed to do about this kind of thing? I guess he's talking about, Stephen, you're talking about the parents taking the children out and also the bullying, the constant bullying that's going on. I assume that's what you're talking about. Andy, do you want to address that? He says both, yeah.
Essentially, from my perspective, I would want to know what the school has done to educate parents as to what initiatives they are engaged in to prevent the bullying. And I would also want to know what the school district has done in terms of educating the parents as to their attendance requirements. Because taking a student out merely because I feel that they may be bullied is not, in my opinion, a valid reason to take a child out of school.
Well, also it says here, there's a question here from Karen Bagwell. Hi, Karen. What should school administrators look at to see how to predict so they can prevent more problems? Well, you're asking for practical steps. I will tell you that there's nothing practical about proper management of students from K to 12. There's no simple solution to this. The bottom line is it has to be grade relevant, it has to be age relevant, it also has to be a specialized, a special custom designed monitoring system for special needs children. You cannot use off the shelf, and this is a problem that Andy and I see, and it's very frustrating. We see schools buying these off the shelf programs, which in our opinion are utterly worthless because every school system is different, every school is different. Every school has its own personality. How can you try to put a square peg in a round hole? What our belief is that you have to use customized systems. You have to take a core curriculum and then you have to customize to that issue. But that brings back this issue of what can school administrators do to predict. First, you have to audit or you have to assess what's going on. Are your policies effective? Are they actually working? Not what you read on paper. What are the actions behind the policies? How are your people using it? What's your classroom management like? Once you've addressed that, then you can start customizing specific ways to predict that through training and a specific plan of action. But many schools, just to meet state requirements, will cannibalize someone else's school system's safety plan, which has no relevance to their own, just so they can get something down on paper. I mean, it's irresponsible, it's unethical, and it creates liability issues. So,
can I just give you a couple of quick examples of that? You know, one of the questions, your question there, Karen, is, you know, what can school administrators do? There are many things school administrators can do. First of all, how many of you at the school or the schools that you work with, or if you're in a current school, how many of you have at least routine daily walkthroughs inside and outside the building? How many of you can say unequivocally, we have a policy that says every teacher or every staff member must wear an ID? How many of you can say unequivocally that everyone does do that in your school? These are just kind of the simple kinds of things. How many of you can say unequivocally no one props open doors in my building? Those are the kinds of things that you can do, your own self-checks. You can be taught as a school system to do your own self-checks. To have an outside company do it has a viable role in the process, to do a security audit. But the real trick is to have yourself as a school system taught to perform your own school audits, at least on an annual basis, and then to have the wherewithal to address the issues that come up.
And by the way, for those of you who are attorneys who have actions or pending actions against school systems, this is that issue I talked about several minutes ago about, do you truly as an attorney understand the layers of management within a school system? Because if you are going to be an advocate for your client, you're going to need to understand the management aspects of a school system, which are complicated. And you're going to have to understand what should be done and what is being done, and making that comparison, which is not always easy. By the way, Stephen McCarthy has another question here. A lot of kids are afraid in some schools I've seen. Some of the TAs are afraid of the kids. Atmosphere of fear prevails in the hall at least. Where do you start to break this up? The bottom line, Stephen, is training. You've got to go in and you've got to train the administrators separately from the staff, from the TAs, and make sure that everybody has a better process for actually dealing with these issues. Fear is an example. If you're in that position, and you're fearing the kids, that fear is based on a lack of proper training and proper management. Your system is broken. And if the system is broken, that's why you fear the kids. And it doesn't matter if you're 5'2", we do this in training, 5'2" person up against a kid who's 6'3" and 250 pounds, you can handle that kid verbally and psychologically, but you've got to have training to do it. And that's where the process is broken down. The training that's out there is poor. One of the things that attorneys don't do when they bring an action against the school system is ask the question, okay, what training has been done? Show me the curriculum of that training. Show me the bios of the trainers. Once you start getting a timeline or a line of events in the training, you start to see where really this is coming from. A lot of it's thrown together at the last minute. That's exactly why there's problems. Stephen asked another question about got any ideas for funding. There's lots of money out there for training. That's something we can send to you off the webinar. But Andy can help you with that. There's lots of money out there. You know, Andy and I hear all the time, you know, there's no money, there's no money. But the thing is, when we're done with administrators, they say, wow, I didn't know all that money existed. It's just a matter of going after it. And a lot of times schools won't go after the funding. Well, if you can go after funding and you don't do it, is that a liability issue? I think maybe it is, because you could have gotten the money to do the training. You never did the training because you didn't go after the funding. Right there is an exposure because you had the opportunity to get money. And many times that's part of the problem also. I don't know if Andy wants to chime in on that.
I want to go really on what you said before that and come back to this. You know, the presentation that we're making almost sounds like we're piling on education, because today it seems to be what I will refer to as the McCarthyism of today. You know, the whipping boy for everybody. Education is the problem for everything that goes wrong in today's world. And the truth of the matter is that's not what we're saying. What we're basically saying is, when it comes to equipment purchases, for those of you who are educators out there, in your training and preparation, how many of you were trained to know the difference between an ASIC H.264 camera and a conventional analog camera? Okay, we weren't. I don't know about you, but by my experience, and I thought I had a pretty good education, that was not part of my training as a teacher, nor was it part of my training as an administrator. As an educator, we're being asked to do things that, when I started in this business, were almost unfathomable. You know, whoever thought when you and I, some of you started out, if you've been in this business more than 20 or 30 years, that we would be talking about Columbine, Paducah, and some of the other incidents. It never really crossed our minds. But why is that important? What's important is because in our training, we were never taught emergency response psychological training. But in fact, we're expecting teachers to behave in a manner that is really contrary to their basic instincts, as Dale had alluded to earlier. And the only way to get around that, the reason a firefighter runs into the fire where you and I run out, is basically by training. We can kind of mitigate some of the problems that we're talking about with proper training. So I guess what I want to make clear is what we're really saying here is that, you know, it's not that teachers aren't doing their job and administrators aren't doing their job completely. It's a lack of training that has led to the exposure that they currently face.
Okay. I got a question here from Phil. And Phil, I need you to clarify so I understand the question and Andy understands the question. Are you talking about, he asked the question, what policies and training should a school give a teacher concerning sexual contact with a student? Are you talking about teacher-student sexual behavior or student-to-student sexual behavior? I wasn't sure, Phil. I'm going to assume that you meant teacher-to-student sexual contact. So I'll answer that part, and then you can clarify, and Andy can he can add, student-teacher sexual behavior. This is a huge problem. As a criminal analyst, I primarily work on sexual assault cases, and one of my specialties on criminal cases is juvenile sex offenders. And I'm going to tell you something. This is a huge, huge problem, and it is one of those problems that's preventable, but nobody knows how to handle it. And in a school environment, the policies have to be specific to the law. And a lot of times we find that school administrators don't know local law or state law regarding sexual contact. A lot of times, now Andy doesn't do this when he teaches, but when I teach, I say, everybody, let's talk about the age of consent in your state. And I'll give 3 answers. I'll say 16, 17, and 18. And I'll get people raising their hand for each age. They don't even know the age of consent in their state. One of the key things in the policy, is to make sure that the administrators and the school board too know the law in that area or in the state level regarding sexual contact. This is a serious problem. One of the things we require our school districts to do is to have the district attorney or the county attorney send someone in to brief them on the law at the start of the school year of what the laws are regarding children and juveniles, so they know what the law is. This is critically important. So as far as policies are concerned, there's another issue here which we talk about in our teacher training, our administrator training. We talk honestly, which nobody else does, about this issue of sexual contact between adults, let's be general here, adult staff members and children and juveniles. And we talk about it. And the reason why we talk about it in the training is because we want to use peer pressure to put on peer pressure from the staff onto other staff members to change their behavior, because every school we've ever been in, every school district we've ever been in, when you ask people if they know if anyone is having sex with students on staff, they raise their hands and they say, sure, we know about it. They know about statutory rape that's going on in their junior highs and high schools. Everybody knows this is going on, but the question is, well, why is nothing being done? Because the policy is poorly designed, it's not based on the law, and there's no management behind it. There's no leadership being shown to quell this stuff. So, Andy, do you want to add to this?
The only thing I would add to it is that that policy that we're talking about, if it even exists, does it have very specific sets of actions that the administrators or the teachers, if I'm a teacher and I know something's going on, what's my responsibility? How do I act upon it? You know, what's the process? Okay? And then have I been certain to educate my entire school community and staff about what their responsibilities are? You know, I see from one of Phil's comments that teachers don't know the law, and I think, again, part of your training, if you go back 20, 30 years, for those of you who are in this business and been in it, you know, really those topics were covered in an extremely superficial level in graduate school, and I think in today's day and age, the expectations for teachers to be a counselor, to be a psychologist, to be all of those things, again, points out to their preparation in college having left them short in the profession itself. What they're taught at the college level and what they have to practice in their day-to-day job, there's a tremendous disconnect between those two. And so what we're again emphasizing is that teachers, administrators, in fact, board members, be educated as to what their responsibilities are when it comes to these kinds of issues. If I can just interject here something that I wanted to say earlier. We've talked about equipment purchases after Columbine and the oftentimes inefficiency of those expenditures of funds. The real focal point for most schools who went out and purchased equipment since Columbine has been on protecting the physical assets of the school system. What we advocate when we work with school districts after we do it, first of all, we won't participate with them in purchasing equipment unless they've done an audit, and that audit includes a assessment of the school culture so that we can understand how the equipment will work in concert with what goes on within the school on a day-to-day basis. But the point simply is, our approach when it comes to purchasing equipment is protecting the human assets first, and then the physical assets. The basic premise is that the physical assets can be replaced. The human assets are irreplaceable and far more devastating to a school community when they're lost. And so the approach is entirely different. I just want to make sure that we made that clear, because I know we mentioned it several times about purchasing equipment.
And Andy, by the way, when we're working with attorneys who have legal actions against school systems, we're going to be looking at that stuff. That's where the weaknesses are. You know, we're going to look at all those weak points that we know are there management-wise that contribute to the liability issues. And if you don't fix them, eventually you're going to pay for them. Karen Bagwell, Karen, hi, you have another question. Could you name off a list of pointers on what school administrators should look for to get quality training for self, staff, or school to distinguish between shallow and comprehensive training? Are there some areas to check for? Well, one of the things I would say is please, and I teach, Andy teaches at university, I'm an instructor at Newman University, but academics generally are not good trainers, because you've got to, if you're doing school safety issues, trainers should have been teachers or administrators who actually were in the classroom, who actually know what it's like to run a classroom or to run a school or to run a school district. That's number one. Number two is they have to be trained in forensic psychology, not general psychology. A lot of you who are listening know about Carl Rogers and Maslow. While Carl Rogers and Maslow may be beneficial for children's learning and development, that general psychology is really worthless when it comes to understanding criminal behavior and understanding safety issues. And so they have to have that forensics background, which is very rare. I would say also they have to be, how can they prove, if you're purchasing that kind of training, can you prove that actually has a management system in it? Is it training to change management in the classroom or in the school? Because if it's just giving out a bunch of information, again, that's the kind of training that when attorneys hire us to work on cases, we rip that apart, because that's just giving out facts. That's not really changing the management systems or the management issues within that school system. So that's also the choice of poor training really contributes. It's the icing on the cake, Karen, to the overall problems in management issues within school systems.
Hey, Dale and Andy, I have a question here from James from New York City who asks, at school dismissal, a 4-year-old child is dismissed without the parent's knowledge. The school administrator had no knowledge that the child had left the school. The child was met on the steps by a FedEx driver and given to the grandfather. No physical injuries to the child, may be able to prove a psychological injury, though. Question. The school is claiming that they aren't liable. Is there a standard of care that schools must follow for managing school dismissal? And how the administration should have prevented this from occurring?
Well, real quickly before Andy answers, because I know he's anxious to answer this one. In New York State, if this happened in New York State, we just told you that it says door-to-door. And dismissing a child, especially 4-year-old, to the steps is not door-to-door. But Andy, go ahead and you can talk about this.
That student was in school as a student at that particular time, if I'm understanding the question correctly. And that student left as a 4-year-old. Unbeknownst to anyone on the school staff, somebody had to let that student go. And Dale uses the word door-to-door. I prefer to use the term portal-to-portal. A school is responsible for a student portal-to-portal. Are we certain that that student was released to the care of someone designated as the parent or acting on behalf of the parent? That's the liability that I don't know how you can say you're not responsible. You had a student within your building, a 4-year-old, and that 4-year-old left the building and no one knew it, and no one verified that he or she left in the care of an adult. I don't know how you can say you're not liable. And it was before dismissal.
It's absolutely a violation of state law, and it's a violation of state law in most states. Peter Sherrill had asked a question about ICS training for teachers and administrators. Can you clarify your question so that Andy and I can answer it? What are you talking about as far as the training is concerned regarding safety, or if Peter can clarify that?
Okay, while Peter's clarifying that, I have a question that kind of piggybacks on something you guys touched on at the beginning of the question and answer session. We have a question from Stephen who asks, is there state or federal law that requires a yearly review of the school safety plan? Does it require an outside review? How should a review of the school safety plan be done?
Well, before Andy answers, I would say that most states have updated their recommendations. Most of the time, it's a state recommendation that you have an audit or a security assessment done once a year. I know that under REMS grants, R-E-M-S grants, and Andy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you are required to partner with outside agencies to do that work, which also includes some type of assessment. But it all depends on the state, you know, and but there are specific guidelines on this from the Justice Department and the Department of Education down in Washington, D.C., USDOJ.gov. So, but Andy, would you like to take that?
Well, I think you've covered just about everything that needs to be said. Yeah, there are clearly either very direct or indirect guidelines that suggest that you should do some form of assessment, some form of violence monitoring or discipline monitoring within your school on an annual basis. Most states now, and it's probably, not probably, it is very likely as a result of NCLB, require some level of reporting of discipline infractions and the kinds of discipline infractions, and they generally require some kind of action items depending on the degree of severity that follows those reports. So the ideal for me, if you're asking about what a district should do, very likely I would ask that the district get trained to by a reputable agency to perform its own annual assessments and how to develop their own action plans to address those kinds of issues that come up.
Oh, and Andy, let me throw something else in here for all of you who are attorneys. When an assessment is done, that's words on paper. It's discoverable in a lawsuit. And so if you have that audit that was done, and many times school districts will do an audit every 3 years or so, which is worthless. I mean, things change on a yearly basis. If that report says you should have done this, this, and this, and they haven't done the things that were asked to be done in that audit, well, right there is a liability. You know, one of the things we tell our school clients is, we're going to give you a list of the top 3, top 5 issues you need to deal with today. And if you don't deal with them, this is a liability. This can be used against you in a lawsuit. So right there is a document that can help in many cases for if you're suing districts, but also if you're an attorney who is working with a school district, you need to find those documents and find out if those things were actually accomplished and if you can prove it. Next, Peter had clarified his question. Here's the problem with instant command and emergency management. We do training through one of our other divisions for state emergency management agency county coordinators. And I will tell you that it shocks me as a professional how poorly many of these county emergency management directors are trained in emergency management. So the problem is things roll downhill, and when you come down to the school system level, while I would agree with you that under FEMA and under federal requirements for first responders, that is critically important, and most of it is very good training. When you get down to the school level, much of this just doesn't work because first responders, fire and rescue, come in and try to train school officials. The problem is that school teachers, by their very nature, have a mindset that is different than the emergency/forensic mindset of first responders. And until you deal with that issue of psychology, the psychological difference, the training difference that creates a different mindset, you need to deal with that first, and you need a customized plan to make sure that happens, to make sure that there is buy-in.
Can I piggyback on that, Dale?
Yes, please.
Because what the real issue in many instances is that there is no established working relationship between the school and first responders. Where school districts have an established working relationship, and by that I mean they have formal meetings several times during the year. And I say formal specifically because if they're not formal and you allow them to chance, they don't happen. And that relationship dissipates, and the strength of any kind of plan that's developed is contingent on what that working relationship looks like. When you have a strong working relationship between the school and the local first responders, and that's met by regular meetings, documented meetings, participant lists, agendas, and notations that are shared then throughout the school system, it sends a level of responsibility and importance to everybody within the system. And it helps to bridge that gap that Dale has just described between the two types of personalities and training levels that are there. And it makes it much, much easier for you to implement a plan that is workable and reasonable and still meets the mandates of all of the emergency guidelines at the federal and state level.
Okay, Matt.
Okay, I'm going to wrap things up. Dale and Andy, I want to thank you for putting together another great presentation. I thought you guys did a great job, and I want to thank all the attendees for taking an hour out of their time to spend with us and submitting such great questions. You know, I really think the question and answer sessions are what make these webinars so successful. We're going to wrap things up now. If you have additional questions, please use the Q&A feature or the chat feature found on the right-hand side of the screen to submit them. Dale and Andy will stay on the line for a couple more minutes and try to answer as many as they can. If you have a project, a consulting project, or a legal case that you're working on that you think could benefit from the work of Dale and his team, please feel free to contact me at 800-523-2319 or via email, and you all have my email address, mhyde@tasanet.com. It's also up on the screen. Dale and his team cover all aspects of school security and safety, including student aggression and violence, parent aggression and violence, truancy, sexual issues, emergency response, staff aggression, subcultural groups, gangs, liability reduction, absenteeism and lateness. Additionally, Dale and his team are experienced in special education management, no child left behind compliance, transportation issues, and classroom management issues. We will be sending out a link to an archived recording of this webinar later on this afternoon. This and all of our webinars are posted in the Knowledge Center of TASA's website. As I said previously, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me at mhyde@tasanet.com. Again, that's mhyde@tasanet.com. I'm going to leave the meeting open for a couple more minutes. If you have questions for Andy or for Dale, they'll do their best to answer them. Otherwise, we look forward to working with you in the future and seeing you at future TASA webinars. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.